I found out my marriage was over on a Tuesday morning while stirring coffee I did not want, because my wife looked at me with the calm confidence of someone who had already rehearsed my reaction. And that was the moment I understood this story would not be about love or betrayal, but about choice and consequences. She said it casually, almost kindly. "I am pregnant," and before I could process joy or fear, she added, "It does not matter who the father is. What matters is who will raise the child." And I remember thinking how strange it was that a sentence could sound so reasonable and still feel like a door slamming shut inside my chest. I did not shout. I did not throw the mug. I smiled because shock sometimes dresses like politeness, and I asked one simple question: "Whose child is it?" She shrugged and said that was a small detail, a technicality, like the fine print no one reads. And in that shrug lived the summary of our last 8 years together. "I am infertile," that was the word the doctors used, as if they were labeling a jar on a shelf. And I had told her everything from the beginning, every test, every awkward silence in sterile offices, every joke I used to pretend I was fine. She used to say we were a team, that family was bigger than biology, that love finds a way. Apparently, love found a way that did not include honesty. She said she did not tell me because she knew I would overthink it, because I would make it complicated. Because in the end, a child needs stability, not questions. And I wondered when stability became a synonym for silence. She talked like she was explaining a sensible business plan, like she had solved a problem efficiently. I listened and noticed how calm she was, how prepared, how this decision had already aged in her mind while I was still waking up. I asked how long she had known. She answered with weeks, then months, then. Eventually, the truth slipped out. Long enough to choose names, long enough to imagine a future where my role was already defined without my consent. I realized then that the betrayal was not just the affair. It was the assumption that I would accept any reality as long as it was delivered with a smile and a speech about maturity. She said, "You always said you wanted to be a father." And I thought about how carefully words can be repurposed when it suits someone. I wanted to say something dramatic, something sharp. But what came out was laughter. Quiet at first, then louder. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity demanded an audience. She looked offended, as if I had broken some unspoken rule. She said, "You are being childish," and I replied, "Maybe. But at least I am being honest." The room felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in to listen. I told her I needed air. She told me not to be selfish. And that was when I understood the real twist. This was not a confession. It was a proposal. She expected me to step into a role already cast, to applaud a play I had never auditioned for, to raise a child while pretending the foundation was not cracked. And as I walked out, I realized the suspense was not whether I would stay or leave. It was how long it would take for me to remember who I was before I started apologizing for things that were never my fault. I did not leave the house with dramatic music playing or rain pouring down like a movie scene. I left with my keys in my hand and a strange clarity in my head, the kind that arrives when denial finally clocks out for the day. I drove without direction because every familiar street felt like a reminder of agreements that were never real. I parked near a small grocery store I had visited 100 times and sat there wondering how a place could look identical while my life quietly rearranged itself. My phone buzzed with her name, and I did not answer. Not out of anger, but because I needed to hear my own thoughts before hers rewrote them again. She had always been good with words, good at framing things, so they sounded generous, progressive, reasonable. She liked to say she was practical. I liked to believe it. Now I realized practical was just her way of avoiding responsibility. I thought about the night the doctor confirmed my infertility, how I had prepared myself to be blamed, pitied, eventually left, and how instead she hugged me and said, "This does not define you." I remember trusting that sentence more than any promise I had ever heard, and now it echoed with a different meaning. When I finally went home, she was sitting at the table scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. She asked if I had calmed down, as if emotions were a temporary software glitch. I asked her who he was, not because I wanted details, but because I wanted to see if she would finally choose honesty. She hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already knew. Someone from work, someone supportive, someone who made her feel understood. All the usual characters in stories like this. I asked if he knew about me. She said, of course, he knows everything, and that was almost impressive. How transparency had been extended to everyone except the one person whose life would be most affected. She said he did not want to be involved, that he had his own situation, and I laughed again because the irony was too sharp to ignore. The biological father had an exit plan while the infertile husband was expected to stay. She framed it as fate, as an opportunity. She said you get what you always wanted without the messy parts, and I asked when lying became a perk. She accused me of focusing on ego, of letting pride ruin something beautiful, and I realized she genuinely believed that disagreement equaled immaturity, that acceptance was the only adult option she recognized. That night, I slept on the couch, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks, because counting something tangible felt safer than counting the ways trust had been dismantled. I thought about the future she envisioned. School events, holidays, small lies stacked neatly on top of each other until they formed a lifestyle. I imagined explaining to a child someday that love is built on half-truths and selective transparency. And something inside me finally stopped negotiating. By morning, I knew this was not about infertility or fatherhood or even infidelity. It was about consent, about the quiet theft of choice. And as I packed a small bag, she asked where I thought I was going. I told her I was going somewhere. I could hear myself think. She said, "You are running away." And I smiled because for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly what I was running toward. Not freedom or revenge or even closure, but clarity, and clarity has a way of making everything else impossible to unsee. I stayed with my brother at first, because he asked questions without trying to fix me. He handed me coffee and let silence do the heavy lifting, and in that silence I started replaying moments I had ignored for years. Small comments she made about legacy and bloodlines, the way she would tense up when friends announced pregnancies, the way she spoke about sacrifice as if it was always someone else's job. I realized I had been so busy proving I was enough that I never asked whether I was respected. She called me every day at first, her tone gentle, rehearsed, patient. She said we can talk this through like adults, that families are built in many ways, that love is a decision, not a feeling. I almost admired the consistency of her argument. It never wavered because it never included my voice. When I finally agreed to meet her in a neutral place, she arrived with a plan already mapped out: schedules, finances, living arrangements. She spoke about the baby like a project with a timeline. She said you will grow into it once you hold the child, as if attachment could be scheduled like a meeting. I asked her one question that stopped her flow. What happens when the child asks where they come from? She said we will tell them the truth when they are older. And I asked which truth, the full one or the edited version. She accused me of being dramatic again, said I was making hypothetical problems instead of focusing on solutions. And that was when I noticed something important. Every solution she offered required me to shrink, to accept less honesty, less agency, less dignity. I told her I would not be part of a story where my role was decided behind my back. She said, "You are choosing pride over family." And I replied, "No, I am choosing boundaries over convenience." She looked genuinely confused by that, as if boundaries were an unexpected language. After that meeting, her calls slowed, then stopped, replaced by messages that alternated between guilt and nostalgia. Remember our trips, remember our jokes, remember who we were. And I remembered all of it clearly, which is why I could finally say goodbye without rewriting history. Weeks passed, and rumors found their way to me through mutual friends. Some painted me as cold, others as heartless. I learned quickly how easily a narrative shifts when one person controls the story. I resisted the urge to defend myself publicly because I understood something new. Truth does not need a marketing campaign. It survives quietly, waiting for the right moment. I started rebuilding small routines, morning walks, evening reading, things that reminded me I existed outside of crisis. And slowly the shock transformed into something steadier. Not bitterness, not sadness, but resolve. I did not know yet what my future looked like, but I knew what it would not be. It would not be built on silence disguised as love. And as that certainty settled in, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had lost something, but because I had stopped carrying what was never mine to begin with. The twist came quietly, the way real ones often do. Not with confrontation, but with information. My brother mentioned something he had heard through a friend who worked in the same building as my wife. Apparently, her version of events was evolving. First, I was supportive, then I was distant. Then I was emotionally unavailable. Infertility had slowly become the centerpiece of the story. Not as a medical fact, but as a personality flaw. I listened without interrupting because every sentence confirmed what I already felt. This was never just about a child. It was about control of the narrative. Around the same time, a lawyer I consulted for practical reasons asked a question that shifted everything. Do you have any written communication where she acknowledges the situation before the pregnancy? And suddenly all those old messages I had never reread took on new weight. I spent an afternoon scrolling through years of conversations, jokes, plans, fears, and there it was, buried between mundane details. Her reassurance after my diagnosis. We will face this together, no secrets. The irony was almost elegant. I realized then that she had not just broken trust, she had contradicted her own stated values. And while I had no intention of turning my life into a courtroom drama, clarity has a habit of empowering options. I sent her one final message asking for an honest conversation without persuasion or pressure. She agreed, maybe sensing the shift. We met again, and this time she was different, less confident, more guarded. I told her calmly that I would not contest the pregnancy or interfere in her life, but I would also not participate in a family built on omission. I asked her if she understood why. She hesitated, and for the first time admitted she was afraid I would leave if she told me the truth earlier. And I said quietly, "And now you know the cost of deciding for someone else." That sentence landed heavier than any argument. She did not cry, she did not argue. She simply nodded, and in that nod was the end of our marriage. Not in anger, but in acceptance. Walking away that day felt different from the first time. Lighter, more intentional. I stopped seeing myself as the man who was left and started seeing myself as the man who chose not to stay. The difference mattered more than I expected. Over the next months, I watched from a distance as her carefully managed story began to fray. Inconsistencies surfaced. Questions followed. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive. Just the slow erosion that happens when a foundation is not aligned with truth. I did not celebrate that. I simply observed it as confirmation that walking away had been the right decision. Because peace built on self-respect lasts longer than any comfort built on compromise. And that realization stayed with me as the final shape of this chapter came into focus. Not as a tragedy, but as a recalibration. One that quietly but firmly returned my life to my own hands. Time has a way of revealing motives once emotions stop doing all the talking. And as months passed, I noticed how my thoughts about her shifted from confusion to clarity. I stopped asking why she did it and started understanding how she justified it. She believed outcomes mattered more than process, that good intentions could excuse poor choices, and that belief explained everything, including why she never truly apologized, only explained during a casual conversation with a mutual acquaintance. I learned something unexpected. The man she had been involved with had also walked away completely. Not just from her, but from the story she had built. And suddenly her insistence that fatherhood was about who raises the child sounded less philosophical and more defensive. I felt no satisfaction in that revelation, only relief that my instincts had been right, that staying would have meant absorbing consequences that were never mine to carry. I focused instead on rebuilding parts of myself I had neglected. I traveled alone for the first time in years, discovered that silence can be restorative when it is chosen. I reconnected with old friends who knew me before I learned how to minimize myself, and slowly I stopped introducing myself in my own head as the infertile one, because that label had taken up far more space than it deserved. One evening, she reached out again not to argue but to inform me. She said she was moving closer to family for support. She thanked me for being calm through everything, and I understood then that calmness had been mistaken for agreement. I wished her well sincerely, and meant it, because resentment would have been another form of attachment. After that call, I sat for a long time thinking about the strange pressure placed on men to accept anything framed as responsibility, to confuse endurance with virtue, to believe that saying no makes you smaller. And I realized my quiet refusal had been the most responsible choice I could make, not just for myself, but for the truth. My life did not suddenly become perfect, but it became honest, and honesty has a stability that performance never can. I started volunteering mentoring young men at a community program, not as an expert, but as someone who had learned the value of self-respect the hard way. I never told them my whole story, only the parts that mattered, that you are allowed to question narratives that exclude your consent, that love without honesty is just expectation in disguise. And as I watched them listen, I felt something settle into place. Not fatherhood, not replacement, not consolation, but purpose. A sense that my worth had never been tied to biology or roles imposed by others, and that understanding prepared me for the final chapter of this story. Not as an ending, but as a continuation grounded in choice rather than obligation. By the time the legal details of the divorce were finalized, the emotional work had already been done. Paperwork felt almost ceremonial, a formal acknowledgement of a decision made long ago in quieter moments. I moved into a smaller place with more light and fewer memories, and for the first time, my surroundings reflected my internal state. Simple, intentional, uncluttered. People asked if I felt empty living alone, and I told them no. I felt accurate. Accurate about what I wanted and what I would no longer tolerate. Occasionally, updates reached me through indirect channels. The child was born healthy. She was leaning heavily on family support. Life was moving forward in its own imperfect way. I felt compassion without involvement, which I had once thought impossible. But distance has a way of softening edges without erasing boundaries. One afternoon, I ran into her unexpectedly at a bookstore. We exchanged polite conversation like acquaintances who shared a long chapter but no longer needed to reread it. She looked tired but steadier. She told me she hoped I was happy, and I said I was. Not in the triumphant way people expect, but in a grounded one. Because happiness built on self-betrayal is loud and fragile, while happiness built on self-respect is quiet and durable. As I walked away, I noticed there was no lingering ache, no unfinished argument. Just closure earned through consistency rather than confrontation. I thought about how close I had come to accepting a life shaped by someone else's decisions. How easily love can be weaponized when it is stripped of transparency. And how strength sometimes looks like walking away without applause. I continued mentoring, I continued traveling, I continued building routines that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I had been asked to be. And in doing so, I learned something unexpected. That letting go of one dream does not mean abandoning the idea of meaning. It simply creates space for new definitions. I no longer measured my life against traditional milestones or borrowed expectations. I measured it against alignment, whether my actions matched my values, whether my relationships allowed room for truth, and whether my choices honored my dignity. And more often than not, the answer was yes, which made everything else secondary. The suspense I once felt about my future dissolved into curiosity, a far more pleasant emotion, because curiosity invites growth rather than fear. And as this chapter neared its natural close, I understood that the real resolution was not about what I lost, but about what I refused to lose myself in. Compromise without consent, love without honesty, and a life that asked me to disappear quietly for the comfort of others.